in the field of education and total upliftment of the society and nation. So, vibrant students union and discuss this change of educational policies. It is our duty to discuss. That's why today SSF National Committee itself conducting this talk on educational policy. Today we have many friends, those who are watching in live. Also, we have our guest in panel discussion and leaders of National SSF. First of all, I'm thanking you all to give your valuable times to the. Also, I'm welcoming our guest, Dr. Khwaja Mohammed Ziyauddin, and Dr. PK Yasser Arafath sir to this discussion. They will be discussing about new educational policies of India. As a chairman, will deliver presidential speech, SSF Naeemi al-Bukhari, and will give an introduction about the program, about the talk by Mohammed Farooq Naeemi al-Bukhari. I welcome you all to this program for Sunni Students Federation. That's all. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Now, inshallah, we are hearing from Dr. Farooq Naeemi al-Bukhari, introduction speech. Sir, please.
Bismillah walhamdulillah wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa ashabihi al-faizina bi ridwanillah. Dear brothers, respected dignitaries, we gathered here today to discuss about the National Education Policy 2020 announced by our central government. First of all, we are here not making a blind opposition against this policy. better analysis. What are the problems and hidden agendas behind this NEP? We welcome the recommendation of remaining the HRD ministry as the Ministry of Education. That's okay. We have to reform and update our systems and policies for the new generation. This also acceptable. No doubt. But these policies announced by central government what's the ultimate aim of this government by changing these types of policies and systems? We have to make a comparative study or to compare with the basic of this government and their policies related with Indian democracy, Indian economy, and Indian history and culture. So, we have some doubts or to be cleared by the authority. Some points behind this national educational policy. First of all, what is the demerits of existing educational system in India? Before announcing new educational policy for our nation, the government must to reveal what the basic problems of our existing system. They are revealing that the multidisciplinary system is must to lead our students towards global standards. That's okay. But the existing system of our universities and educational system is to be analyzed by the authority of our education or ministry. Our doubts behind this NEP now, first of all, we fear the national education policy will endanger federal system in the education sector in the country. By centralizing this system, the rights of states on education and universities will lose, and the agendas of central government be applied upon all areas of our country. That will be very dangerous for our federal system. The second one is, what's the meaning of exit point for our primary students? By exit, entry and exit in every level. What's the meaning of exit point for students in the primary level? That will cause to rise the dropout ratio of our primary education. And educational complex system will lead to centralize the education towards high-level students, and the traditional area students or rural area students will be neglected by this system. The third one, the providing an access point from class 8 without demanding a complete ban on child labor is problematic, as the current child labor law allows children to work family enterprises. Education has an important objective of strengthening democratic values in our country. But by this system, the campus democracy, this is against the campus democracy. Therefore, it's also crucial to ensure that students and researchers enjoy all democratic rights guaranteed by the Constitution of our nation. Another point, this is against an independent research. This poses a serious concern over the independent nature of upcoming research, and also will cause an undermining independent research in our universities and higher education. And also, the autonomy caste discrimination and violence are increasing in the education sector. And also the government, the central government actually played their role in every area of our country by applying their discrimination system. They like to apply this discrimination in our educational policy also. In their own vision, the education only for commercial development. So they are not stressing on humanities subjects and also the inheritance of our educational system. By commercializing our education, they are pleasing with the system of.
I think he has some major technical issue. Then
Of course,
what about
yes.
starting the lecture by Dr. Khwaja Ziyauddin sir?
That's
Can we
better.
start?
Yeah,
I think it is better. Later
of
on,
course.
if he join again, we can continue with him.
Of course.
Then let us invite Mr. Dr. Khwaja Ziyauddin sir. Sir, are you ready?
Sir, please come.
Yeah, one second. Good evening. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, the entire team of SSF and the General Secretary of Sunnis SSF as a very vibrant body. It is a pleasure to be part of this panel discussions on such a very, very significant policy of the 21st century India for a couple of reasons. Before I start, let me also mention that I'm very happy that I could see many of the uh, delegates and some of the participants from academia, all across the country, they are joining here. So that is my pleasure that we have people who have been showing immediately just after the national education policy has been visualized and then put in passed as a policy document. I have some hunch and my quick observations. I will not take much of the time as I was informed by the organizer. But let me begin with an idea that my understanding would be with some clarification, seeking not from the policy for myself that why national education policy 2020 is important to us as a citizen. Second, do we need to examine and understanding that NEP 2020 is going to have any kind of impact on backward or excluded communities of the country, which is very important to me personally. And let us go with an idea that if we recall Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, because he needs to be mentioned that any community who forgets their history, who cannot make their history, or who forget the history, they cannot make their own history. When we talk of weaker sections, excluded communities in the country, in a larger context and issues of like national education policy, it becomes essential for us to understand the relevance, the timing, and the way national education policy is put forth before us as a policy document. We also need to understand that efforts to improve national policies on education in post-independent India has been there by all consecutive governments of India. And we have seen that the policy to bring education and take it to the last in the queue in terms of socio-economically backward community of the country has been the vision of the country. And that goes all along with the basic ethos of Constitution of India. So when we look at national education policy, one needs to understand policy from the framework of that this policy is for every citizen of the country. Second, this policy talks about inclusive education from primary to higher educations. And when we have a notion like inclusive education and education for all, the kind of historical context we have in India, the kind of social structure we have lived into the country are important to keep for any student, for any citizens to understand this policy. And why do we talk about education, and why one becomes so serious and has to be serious when we talk about education is basically because education is an important determinant for employment, of income, of mobility of the people in the society. And most important, it is an important tool for the marginalized group of the society. And therefore, the entire historical context of post-independent India, and then efforts by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, Patel, Nehruji, and Gandhiji, their ideas are somewhere very important for a country which has to be very inclusive in every context. And one needs to locate these policy documents because this is not one-time scheme. It is a policy which is going to change overall the nature, the context, and the kind of content we would have in the educational institutions curriculum. And as a student of social sciences, I also need to understand national education policy from the view of how Maulana Azad, who was an education minister, and what kind of efforts he brought in through the policy documents and then implementing those policies into the reality is important. And let us recall the one of the speech, and I'll quote for 16 January in one of the meeting 1948, Maulana Azad says, "We must not for a moment forget it is a birthright of every individual to receive at least the basic education, without which he or he cannot fully discharge his duties as a citizen." Remember, this appears to be very, very silent language, but then the kind of ethos and inclusiveness Maulana Azad could bring into his speeches gives us a scope that national education policy has to be very inclusive, has to be body not only in the document, but also into the kind of initiative this policy is going to give to the Union of India and retrospectively to the different states, because education, as we know, is in the concurrent list where state government's consent and their initiative has to be there. So one need not to go the kind of initiative government of India as an independent nation had taken to improve the educational structure of the country. But let us not forget that the contributions and the kind of vision envisioned by the early independent leaders, which was not only in their life, but the kind of documents they brought in and which we lived for all these 70 years, reflects that India is moving towards much more inclusive educations. But suddenly, once in a day, one finds that Indian education system is not inclusive. Indian education system does not address the backward communities, does not give much attention to the more excluded communities like scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, or minorities in India. Minorities, I would mean that the minorities government of India has referred to. And in that context, I need to mention gross enrollment ratio. It is one of the ambitious aim of any nation, modern nations, which wants to improve the gross enrollment ratio in higher education. I'm talking more about higher education here. And as we know, what is GER? GER is basically talking about the age group of 18 to 23 age group, where what is the percentage of students who are eligible and enroll in the higher education institutions. And that reflects directly to the kind of growth and development any nation could have, and they may have in future as well. So India, we see we have traveled for a very long journey from 12% of literacy to 74 in 2011 since independence. So that shows a drastic change, a high level of movement. But we do not have, and we did not examine the enrollment or literacy on the basis of socioeconomic backwardness or the people belonging from different marginalized communities, which apparently becomes an important tool to understand any educational policies. And it became important for many researchers in the later last 20 years. And that is the reason the government of India, any nation, not only the country which is our country, but any GAR reflects their kind of efforts they have made. And for example, if we see 2017 and 18, where we have 26.3% of GAR in higher education, whereas it was 25.8 in 27. So in a year we find a jump. But if you locate GAR of the groups who are from backward communities, who are from the marginalized group, that reflects the original nature and scope, what kind of policy we have and what are the consequences on those communities. And then, for example, scheduled caste students, scheduled tribe students, Muslim as a minority groups, or in very few number. I'll give an example of Muslim minority. Just 5.2% belong to who were enrolled in higher education in one of the report. No, so these are the indicators which makes us to feel that any national policies has to address these communities. And lastly, to mention another indicator to understand policy is on the basis of gender. There are other, but I would restrict and talk on this. But quickly to give an example that on the basis of gender, where you have female students comprising 48.6% in terms of their GR, which is slightly better in terms of male students. So female have 26.4% GR in higher education, whereas male have 26.3. So this is the only rosy picture we have in the past, where higher enrollment in terms of GR is slightly in 0.1% better among the female. So keeping this, why do we have an inclusive, why do not you talk of, or we talk of any inclusive educational system where access to students from different socioeconomic background is very necessary to tap the diversity of their talents and the kind of creativity those communities have. Inclusive society is spoken a lot, but do we talk of inclusive society in terms of giving equal educations with equal opportunity is the essential question which we need to examine in this policy. Second, equal access is very important, and equal access not from the point of view of gender, disability, or the other factor, but then the historical marginalization of the communities, which are shown in the recent studies in India, that scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, minorities, Muslims as one of the largest minorities, have been much more lagging in higher education. And that needs to be taken here. So when we read through the National Education Policy 2020, it shows a lot of good understanding that it is very ambitious, very extraordinary. It looks like an extraordinary document which would give 21st century India a new India, a new country where higher education is going to be focused to the nation building process. And if we see, it talks of, so why we talk about it? It talks of certain components, and those components, for example, school education is one component. I could say we have another component or segment talking on higher education. The third, very important, is talking about very broadly and very specifically on professional education, technology, digital education, etc., wherein a lot of questions comes into, because as many of us remember that in recent past, last pandemic period, all these months, we have been talking about digital divide on the basis of who could access and who can access, or which group can access digital learning process is one of the challenge we have. Lastly, it talks about how to implement those recommendations. So I'm not much talking about school educations, but let us take from a school, the area of school education, let's take that the language as an important issue. Yes, in language, it talks about 3 language policies where the states can, take, choose, and the student can choose at least 2 languages. Then 2 languages has to be the regional languages. But then all these paragraphs and pages which talks on languages are preferably again enforcing the government school and regional, the states on the basis of regional languages to take up their education in regional languages. Who and who takes these regional languages? Who takes the regional languages in their primary school education system? It is primarily those who have been marginalized for years, for centuries, due to the excess, due to the kind of resources, lack of resources they have. So you feel that it is in a kind of inclusive education where students have choice to choose and take their own languages. It may appease the parents. It may gives a kind of happiness, a satisfaction, sense of satisfaction that I can choose my own language. But are they really going to benefit the community? Is an important question here. And that needs to be, are we really confident that the private and convent school education system will take up regional languages? They'll not. They have never taken up, and they will not go for taking regional languages or native Indian languages in their, in at least the what 3 language policy is envisioned into this document. And that is the reason these are very important. So what could be key takeaways? What could be the important points which we can learn out of this document? One important paradigm shift which clearly comes into the document is that NAP swiftly gives an scope for foreign universities to come inside in higher education systems. However, let us remember that foreign universities have not shown much interest, at least the standard internationally established universities of the world have not shown much interest to come inside the country. They have collaboration, they have institutional affiliations, they have some kind of offer to give to the students here, but they have not come up openly here. But this document gives that scope, and those foreign universities can come up here. And it is quite easy for a state, for a union government to provide that platform, because now the national education policy proposes to have one regulatory body. Unlike we have university grants commissions, we have AICTE or so many other bodies which regulates different forms of education in India. So when you have this one policy, it gives you some sense of satisfaction. There is some kind of clarity that yes, maybe when you have one regulatory body, this may provide a platform to take easy decisions, to make transparency in terms of offering the courses, the curriculum, the content of the curriculum, and then the incorporation of the stakeholders, what to study, what not to study in the course curriculum. But do we also not have this inhibitions or this hunch that such a single body, a regulatory body, may be appearing to be very or ideologically very significant to somebody who wants to pinch in their ideology, or someone who wants to make the curriculum of entire country as one? That, for example, the student can choose credit from or have freedom to move from one institutions to another institutions, keeping their own interest of subject courses. But all this appears to be very rosy, but when we talk about implementing these things, a lot of coordination between state and central institutions, between deemed institutions or institutions run by minority communities will be challenging. Second, this policy appears to be more value loaded, where one wants to control the entire curriculum and content of the higher education, including school education system, wherein you can directly monitor what kind of curriculum it is there. We have already witnessed in social sciences curriculum, subaltern views are coming up, where social sciences in India have not addressed the real core curriculum of the entire communities of the society. So it doesn't address the socio-economically backward groups, religious minorities, or constitutionally referred scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, in terms of reading them in social sciences. We have not seen. So inclusive education in India have been one metaphor in one sense. Yes, those metaphors are referred by different names or nomenclature. That is that apart. So NEP thinks of or envisions of having reform within the education system in India, and this is one of the action which government of India has taken up. Yes, it has a vision, a scope to include, for example, the change in the name of MHRD. Now it is Ministry of Education. But it includes and gives a scope to have state education boards, school boards, central board like NCERT, or what we have in recent part, CABE, a Central Advisory Board of Education, or National Testing Agency, etc. These are the agencies which will be jointly reviewing the progress, which is the target of the national education policy in schools and higher education. So these are some of the challenges there. Now, it talks a lot of issues which for a student of social sciences or a citizen of the country feels that it is not only a document, but is a chapter. Every chapter or every section has lengthy description about it. But what we need to take away from this is more important. It is not about scrapping a course like Master in MPhil, what we say, or is making +2, +3, 4, and 2, or giving option for master's degree, etc. Those are some areas where we will have more debates, more discussions. But what I here find that when we talk about what kind of exclusion it may create, what kind of more discrimination it can create, or what are the challenges for the excluded groups of or excluded communities in India, we need to think that what kind of stake people from backward communities, people from minorities, or Dalits have in higher education. Do they have any say in the policy making process? And for that, we need to include the issues of lack of knowledge of the backward communities on what kind of education, availability of educational opportunities are there. Financial constraint of the people who are already socioeconomically backward. It talks about admission processes, language barriers. Language barrier has always been debated in India, post-independent India, and it has never been sorted out. People have variance, logic and rationals to talk on language as a means for learning, mother tongue as their primary learning process, or what kind of language, which language should be at the higher education body. So these are the contentious issues which has been there in the society. But has national education policy thought of the communities, SC, STs, OBCs, or socioeconomically disadvantaged groups? We have, in the recent past, we have very token policies which were partially being implemented. I'll give you two examples. One example is when we talk of fellowship being given to the people from disadvantaged group, and that if you talk of Rajiv Gandhi National Fellowship for the students pursuing their higher educations, or all religious minorities are being given Maulana Azad National Fellowship. But if you see the evaluations and then records of implementations of these policies have been very poor. very bad. And it is the implementation part is always very bad when we talk of the disadvantaged groups. It's only because the society we live in, the social structure where we are located are purely and very crudely hierarchized, and the kind of unequal structure it has also reflects on the agencies, the institutions which implement it. So the institution which is responsible to implement some of the token kind of policy implementation is also not doing that. So what kind of expectation we have from a huge policy which is envisioned in NEP 2020 is the most significant question we have today. We need to see, if we see page number 39 and 40, where in 12.1 item, or the item number 14, it talks about equity inclusion in higher education. So the document looks like it captures the need of the people who are excluded and bring into the inclusionary process of getting higher educations. But when you have high level of dropout at primary school, at the school level, and then at the undergraduate level, because of their socioeconomic backwardness, does the policy has simultaneously address in terms of giving incentive, in terms of giving financial support, in terms of giving residential support to students studying? What, in contrast, we have seen in the last couple of years that in all central universities, at least, the funding given to central universities are being drastically reduced. You do not have initiative to begin any new institution, new residential system. So the kind of funding, the kind of financial support given to higher education institutions are very important to have inclusive education. The jargon, the nomenclature like SE, DG, socioeconomically disadvantaged group, it also gives or blur the location of the people who are really marginalized. One needs to directly address who are the marginalized, why they are marginalized, and for those reasons, national is one, and a which is not there in this, and that is the reason NEP has to be understood very carefully. And while understanding these policies very carefully, one needs to understand the kind of social structure, the kind of hierarchy we have in Indian society, and those hierarchical unequal distribution of resources, unequal distribution of chances to access higher educations are some of the important points where we need to understand. And the last point before I conclude, that one needs to locate education system in India, or primary education has already been much more privatized. It is almost like government schools are invisible. They may be existing on or in across the communities, but in terms of their outreach, in terms of their quality, in terms of the kind of fund it gets, are already in the very worst phase. Higher education in India is perhaps going to get more privatized, more liberal, where the access and entry of people from weaker sections, backward communities, scheduled castes, or minorities will become more difficult, more challenging, and what at one hand we are thinking of having gross enrollment ratio to increase from all SES group, but here we are going to have a policy which will also open up for private sectors, foreign investors to invest into Indian universities, which will not think for any reservation policy, which may not discuss and have a kind of policy which could be more inclusive. So national education policy is going to be very challenging, despite of the big promises which shows to us, despite of the huge scope it is capturing, and a lot of hope from the National Education Policy 2020. But time will tell, because the union and state governments have to implement it, and the kind of funding on education out of our GDP we have is another question we need to examine in future come. So with these brief, my observation and understanding of NEP as of now, I think I should stop here. And thank you so much, SSF. Now over to the organizer.
Okay, thanks, sir. Thanks a lot. Now we are going to hear from Ahmed Ali on National Educational Policy 2020.
So myself Ahmad Ali. So I worked as a change maker fellow of Delhi government in education department. So we are talking about the National Education Policy 2020. The Khwaja Ziyauddin sir spoke about the higher education, what the changes already is going to happen in the higher education, and also talk about the what Ambedkar said and what the ideas of Ambedkar, how this policies how we can look this policy from the perspective of ideas of the Ambedkar. In that perspective, I can say that if you are observing this policy or analyzing this policy, we can see that it is to some extent it is the anti-Ambedkarite ideas, because this policy is the silent on the reservation, and this policy is also silent about the economically weaker sections, and this policy is also silent about the regulation about in the perspective of fees and fee structure and other things. So we will talk about the first of all, please try to analyze this policy. I am just requesting all of you who are over here to just hear this discussion or participate in this discussion. Please try to analyze this from the different aspect of the policy document. Rather than analyzing its content, try to analyze this policy from the political perspective and administrative perspective, and also as we do from the perspective of educational and its philosophical and theoretical perspective. From the political perspective, we will analyze its political agenda, how it is formulated, how it is developed, what kind of political intervention has been done. So as we know, this is bypassed by the Parliament, didn't discuss it or haven't discussed it in the Parliament, or having raised it for any public debate. That is one problem. Another thing is from the administrative perspective, we have to analyze how it is going to execution. What about its affordability? What about the feasibility? What about the effectiveness of the ideas already written in this policy? The main factors of analysis, in my perspective, we have to just keep in mind about the two factors. One factor is how much supportive this policy, how much supportive to the achieve the goals and objectives and aims, values spoken in our constitution. So that is the one factor. A second factor, we have to keep in mind about the philosophical background of the political economy. So we can see, if we are reading this policy document, we can see there is highly developed on the neoliberal approaches or neoliberal background. So how we can in a it's a neoliberal type or neoliberal background level developed policy. So because we are the India, the socialist country, we are changing. It is going to neoliberal level Their approaches is dependent upon the developed policy on the background of the theoretical background of the neoliberal policy. So what will happen for them? What about the poor? What is the marginalized community? Is it will be affordable for them? That is a question we have to discuss in detail. Anyway, so in generally, understand this or analysis this policy as a this is the continuation of the propaganda and agenda which have been implemented since 2014 by the government or the BJP government. Rather than analyzing its content, so what will the from the 2014 they are since 2014 they are implementing or there are different kind of programs and the projects and the different kind of changes they have already adopted, different kind of decision they already taken in the banner of the MHRD. So the it's this policy came or approved as a continuation of this program. This is a part of the great political agenda that we have to understand first that point. Secondly, this is a policy. Generally, it is highly centralized. Even it is a threat to federal system in education and the defeating the federal system because all even education already changed their name, its name, department name of the ministry is already changed. And another thing is they are just trying to implementing the Rashtriya Shiksha Abhiyan like that name. I just like that name. So the head of that session or the committee will be the prime minister. So in that case, school education is highly centralized. The all power it is going to that committee. That committee is headed by the prime minister. And in higher education, there was, as Sir said, Ziyauddin Sir said, that there was a ICTE, UGC, there was a one committee for the teacher education. But all these three agencies now just form get transformed to one agency. Just change it to as one agency, though all powers are centralized. That's also one form of the centralization. So see why they are promoting the centralization in this policy, because the factor of the centralization is a part of the agenda of fascist agenda. The fascism always try to the centralize the power. That's we can see throughout this policy document. They are trying to centralize in one aspect. The another generally in another point is this is a highly regulated and poorly funded. This policy trying to highly regulate the education system in terms of the school education or the terms of the higher education, and the poorly funded. Even they are just saying that India should spend 6% of the GDP. This the same thing we are talking since 1948. The report came on 1948, and the Kothari Commission came on for 66, and the National Education Policy came on 68. All policy documents talking about the expenditure of the 6% of GDP, but till now it is not happening. Why? Because there is no point of mentioning just about the expenditure, the amount of expenditure or percentage of expenditure, but there should be a legal procedure. There should be a legalizing, or there should be an act or legally or some legalizing provisions to the expending uh, exact amount of the or exact percentage of the GDP. But this policy is not talking or not suggesting for any legalizing or this kind of suggestions. Another thing is the privatization. We can see, as sir said about that already, the privating the higher education, especially privatization in higher education, because if the higher education is going to privatize it, then it should be a question mark for the higher education, should be a question mark for the poor people, and a question mark for the marginalized people. It cannot be affordable for them, and then these people should be excluded from the higher education. This policy talking about the foreign university bill, but not talking about the regulation. What will happen if the foreign university bill come? What about its fee structure? What about the expense of the education? So this policy is always silent like that matters. So it is totally it is going to privatize this higher education sector. In the principle, it is saying that they're taking the approach of private philanthropic partnership. In previous document or document or policy document, it was the public-private partnership. But now they are promoting private philanthropic partnership. Why not public here? So this is also point out and suggesting or indicate that this is going to privatization of the higher education. So in another the factor, this policy is silent on the economically weaker section. This policy is silent on the reservations. This is also another factor of the privatization. The next generally next point is how this policy formulated. What the criteria of they are adopted for the formulation of this policy? This is a political question. Anyway, as the policy formulating team argued that they are just received the lack of suggestions and opinion from the public, and they are consulted different pupils and stakeholders, NGOs and pupils and different representatives in the MPs and MLAs. All they are just arguing for that. But what about after receiving the suggestions? How they formulated these suggestions? What they did? What kind of criteria they adopted to just formulate this policy? This is one question. Is there any particular criteria? Is there any particular tool, or is there any particular method to just formulate this or articulation of these suggestions or formulate this policy? That is the one question. Another is the policies mentioning good ideas. A lot of good ideas. A lot of if you are analyzing this policy from the theoretical and conceptual background of the education, we can see good ideas and good concept and the good theoretical background. But for example, if you are talking about the changing the pattern of school, recently. Previously, it was a 10 plus 2, 3. Now it is going to transfer to the pattern of the 5 plus 3 plus 3 plus 4. Okay, we are realized that the current pattern is failure, utterly failure. We can see its a result and impact on the society. But while they are changing from the current pattern to next pattern, or they are adopting a new pattern, why they adopted this? Why not third pattern? They should. They are supposed to mention some rationale. why, sir, attempt a why question there, but they didn't. Policy did it. Policy was very utterly failure in that context. The another from the minority perspective, the policy is not promoting Urdu language in the schools. Urdu language is highly neglected in school level, but talked about the Urdu language in higher education. Unless Urdu language is not taught in the school level, especially where the basic literature is given, what will be the future of the Urdu language in after the 10 years? So it is similar to killing or destroying the Urdu language or avoiding the Urdu language. So next point is from the perspective, if you are talking about the language, they are talking about the foreign language, but they are deliberately silent on the or deliberately avoided the Arabic language. Why? Because we know the Arabic language is the medium of communication for the earnings of lakh of Indians. Even India have a good relationship with Arabian countries, but lot of lack of Indian people are depending for the Arabic language for their earnings or their job opportunities and job necessaries. But this policy is avoiding the Arabic language. That is also a question. The next is the madrasa education. Madrasa education is the parallel education system. It has been since the independence, before the independence, it is running in India as a parallel education system under the government system. There are a madrasa board, there is a committee for the madrasa education, there is a state madrasa board, different state madrasa board. But why this policy is not talking about the madrasa education system, but a draft of this policy education document already talked about the madrasa education and suggested for the renovation and the adopting the or improvement talked about the improvement of the madrasa education and its curriculum. But this policy is not talking about that. That's also one question. That's also one problem. And another problem of this political problem is the secularism. While this policy is talking about the constitutional values and its ideas, they are silent, deliberately silent on the secularism. They are not mentioning the secularism. That's also political agenda we can see. The another broad area of this policies, I understand that that is a practical and administrative issue. For example, they are just suggesting that the Indian education should increase the GER percentage in higher education to the 50% by 2030. Now currently it is 25%. So how will we reach there? What is the practical solution for reaching to the 50% from the 25%? How we can reach there? In the now in the school enrollment rate, it is now 16%. The policy says suggesting to reach 100% by 2013. How we will reach? So in that sense, the policy is not talking about the. We know it is the visionary document, but even though the details and clarification about the practical perspective of these suggestions should be there, it is supposed to, but it is not there. That's also one another problem of this policy. So, and they are talking about the changing the time of duration of the right to education from, they are changing the time from the 3 to 16, the age of the 3 to 16. So how they are going to implement that? Since it's 2009, the right to education is implemented, have been implemented 2009, but still now these people are not aware of going to implement next level of the RTA, right to education. So this also the great administrative problem and the practical problem and issues of this policy. And so we can see we have to analyze this policy document from the perspective of political agenda and the administrative issues in detail. We know as we all about discussed read about that the RSS wing, even the educational wing of the RSS already actively involved, actively participated in formulating this policy document. That's why the Urdu language is neglected. That is why Arabic language is neglected. And they are not mentioning about the minorities and their current status. Even this is the national education policy came after the Sachar Commission report, which talked about the educational status of the one particular community. But this policy didn't adopt any ideas or suggestions or the report or the status of the Muslims which I have talked about in Sachar Committee report. That's also a big problem, which issue to be raised and to be discussed in public and to be discussed for a debate, for a great debate. So that's all I have to mention here in this short time. Thank you, SSF National Committee, for conducting this great discussion. So, sure.
Okay. Mr.
It was a
we
great talk by both the Khwaja sir and Ahmad Ali sir. Thank you very much. And our General Secretary will continue.
you would not like to elevate our discussion now. I am going to say some highlights of our meeting. That means from starting of our discussion up to this time, the first one, existing system of our education to be discussed publicly and to require new policy in front of our existing system. The second one, this system will endanger us to our federal system of our nation. The third one, commercialization of education is not good for our society. The another one, privatization of education will defect on our rural area students and tribal area schools and institutions. The school system is centralized with global system of schooling, but really is a contradiction between global system and our proposed system. Globally concerned, the schooling should be after age of 5. The next one, exit point will cause child labor or that give a license to child labor system. The next one, it's totally against the campus democracy. The next one is against social justice. Caste discrimination and violence are increasing in the education sector. So we have to review about the national education policy. It's also against independent research. Spending of more time in our education system for study of languages will cause problem generally and internationally. The autonomous university structure proposed by NEP is a symbol of governmental aim to free from spending money for education. By telling these highlights of this point, I would like to conclude my speech now. Inshallah, after the vote of thanks, we'll conclude this session. This is the first speech or first function conducted by Sunni Students Federation of India in the name of Seminosium 1. This series will continue after this session or in coming days and weeks. Okay, thank you for all.
Do you allow to leave now? Is it concluded?
Okay, sir. Thank you very much. We are really happy to hear your talk and the talk of Professor Mohammed Ali sir. Both have talked very well, and we got an idea about the this new policy passed by the government. And inshallah, we will stay in touch with you in future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Okay, thank you, sir. Let us conclude.